The other like theoretical. Sorry, there's a fly. I don't know. I was going to hit it. Like, hate nature. No, don't hate nature.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. This video is an interview with Declan Wiffen, who is a lecturer in literature and the author of Indiscriminate Lanking. We'll talk about this book as well as several zines that he has put together and his interest in lichen and queer nature. I hope you enjoyed this interview and I'll see you on the other side. Hi Declan.
Hi, Dan.
It's nice to have you today. So we're going to talk about your collection, Indiscriminate Lanking. And I'm saying collection because I don't know. Do you call it a poetry collection? Are these prose poems? I was wondering about the style and also if you could tell me about the process of how you wrote this book.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because Dan very helpfully sent me a few questions in advance. Do I think of them as prose poems? Like, not really. But I know they kind of are, but I don't think of them like prose poems. So it says poems on the book because that's what it was published as. I mean, I just think of them as like little texts, little texts, which are usually about anything between like half a page and a page. So yeah, I'm happy for them to be called prose poems or texts or another descriptor that people might want to put on them. Yeah, so I would think of it as like, yeah, a pamphlet of texts. To give a little bit of context of like how this emerged, I was trying to work on another project. This often is the way that things happen in my life. I'm trying to do one thing and I end up doing something else. And I was struggling with this other project, and I was like struggling to like articulate what I wanted to say, and basically I felt unable to write anything for this project which was making sense or that I was happy with. And I decided, as a way of like trying to help myself, like I often do what people would like call morning pages or like journaling, of like trying to get stuff out in the morning before you like sit down and do your actual writing project for the day or whatever you're working on. But it seemed like the morning pages wasn't like enough. I was still struggling to do the other writing. So I decided that I would start a daily practice where I would like collect up all of this like junk in my mind that I felt like was getting in the way somehow. And I would like somehow collate all of this junk, our waste. We also felt like quite excessive, like lots of it. And I would like put it into a small document or a text. And I ended up putting them on Instagram after I'd collated these scraps of thoughts and phrases and observations with an image. So like that was part of the process. And I was also at the time keeping a dream journal. I'd been trying to think about like why I was stuck or why like things I wasn't quite being able to write in the way that I wanted to. And I was kind of thinking about what being stuck meant to me. And I came across a book called Attention Seeking by Adam Phillips, psychoanalyst and writer in the UK. He talks about like an unknowing attention that we have, which is like beyond conscious attention. So partly, yeah, our unconscious is attending to things beyond our conscious awareness. And I was kind of really interested in this. So some of the stuff that went into the dream journals, which I remembered when I woke up and I wrote down, makes its way into lanking. This was in a period of time when in the UK it was like post-lockdown, but I was like going for a walk in the morning and I was usually going for a walk in the evening as well. So I was doing a lot of walking and I was living in like quite a rural part of Kent where I didn't really have many neighbours, and there was just like fields and countryside and woodland all around me. So in one sense, like it was relatively isolated. Every time I went for a walk on my phone, I would just like jot down things that I saw that I found interesting, or that after I'd walked past like 10 minutes later or half an hour later, I was like thinking about again. I was like, I don't know why I'm thinking about this particular wildflower or this particular object. So I would just note them all down. And sometimes as I was doing so, like a phrase would come to me that didn't really make any sense, but I would just put it in the note part of my phone. And then all of this stuff that felt like it wasn't feeding into the other project, that was going to be wasted or that wasn't really doing anything, I felt like I would like recycle it and put it into this project that became Indiscriminate Lanking. So it was a type of collage of things that didn't make sense as a way of trying to think about an attention and a way of articulating things that didn't have to make sense. And I was doing this as a kind of exercise or experiment to try and free up the other writing, which both did and didn't happen. But what did come out of it was this collection.
When did you realize you had a project that you could actually put it together into a book form?
That's a good question. So I did this throughout the month of June. And there was something about sharing it without being too self-conscious. I was like, the syntax is a bit messed up. The phrases don't necessarily mean something clear, or the way that like things are juxtaposed don't necessarily like run on in a smooth way. It's a bit messy. But the fact of sharing it on Instagram with an image was helpful to me. So I did that in June, and then in July, I decided to change the process a little bit, whereby I would just send it to one person, somebody who had kind of like engaged with it on Instagram in that first month, you being one of them. Yes. And then at the end of July, I sent what I had to a few friends and talked through like, do we think this is something? Do we think it's just like a whole heap of mess? Like, did a little bit of editing, played around a little bit with the order, but not too much. So there is another July edition. I sent it to a few places, a few people. It's slightly more prosy than poetic, perhaps. The question was, when did I realize I had a collection? I guess kind of when I shared it with a few people and talked through whether or not it kind of worked as a whole. I think sometimes you don't know and you think, well, this is what I've done.
Yeah, here it is.
This is what I've got, yeah.
And I was also interested in the sort of crossover between journal writing, and I called it that just because at the moment I'm tutoring a course at the poetry school on poetic journals, and some of the features, the style, the way you're writing with different registers together is quite close to some of the work that people have done with the poetic journal.
Yeah, I think it was kind of like a process-led, I guess you could call it process poetry. It was like, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to allow in anything that kind of the indiscriminate of the title is like anything that comes and sticks and is still there at the end of the day when I end up writing this is allowed in. Like, it's indiscriminate. So there are like quotations from things I was reading, lines from songs or poems. So yeah, anything was allowed in. And I guess in journaling or morning pages or like a kind of writing practice that underpins a writing project for a particular project, like a collection or writing a poem, there's that stream of consciousness element whereby you're just like trying to keep your pen on the paper or your fingers typing, and like allowing whatever comes to come out onto the page. And I guess in that sense, maybe that's not how everybody journals. I don't know. Does that sound similar to the things that people do or you do on your course?
Yeah, it does. Not everyone does that, but yes, all these different layers of experience that you try to put together. Yeah.
Right at the beginning of lockdown, I spent quite a bit of time actually listening to the audiobook of Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg, which I know is like a total classic, a total cliche classic almost of like what creative writing teachers and practitioners talk about. And I'd read it before, and I'd used some like sections in teaching before, but it had never like had that much of an impact. Um, but listening to her read it, at the end of each section of the book, she kind of, there's like an additional section where she comments on like looking back on, like maybe she wrote it 20 years ago, I can't remember the exact date, but she adds in a commentary, and there's something about the energy of her reading it and commenting on what she was like suggesting that was like really, I don't know, it had like quite a profound impact on me. And in a kind of an attempt to allow myself to write whatever came, rather than, you know, you have your censor or your superego or your critic, your inner critic, like saying, well, that isn't really what writing should be like, which is kind of how I was feeling about the other project. And this was an attempt to be like total like id-esque writing experience.
You've done a lot of work around cruising nature, workshops on cruising the estuary. I have two of the zines, the participatory zines that you've got, like Cruising Nature, the spring edition, and I'll have to beep it, Fuck Plans. Can you say a bit more about how you got into this topic and how that informs your writing?
So this other project that I am like somewhat resistant to talk about, because I'm just returning to it, and it's kind of, it's a bit of like, it's like a problem for me. I had been interested in lichen for like a long time, and like had done a bit of research and a bit of reading. During lockdown, I was out walking, and I would sometimes come across lichen and become interested in it and think about it and maybe write about it and photograph it, etc. And then somebody asked me, like on Zoom or something, they were like, oh, you must know like a lot of the names of lichens now. You've been thinking about it for a while. And I was like, actually, I don't really. And I felt like a little bit embarrassed, a bit like, oh, you know, I have been spending a lot of time thinking about this and trying to articulate myself when in like, why am I interested in this organism? I knew a few names, but I didn't like, there are like hundreds of species, if not thousands of species. It got me thinking about like, why didn't I know the names? Like, why was that not an interest? And I realized that it was kind of more this like instinctual desire that I was following, that it was like outside of this, like, this is what I should be doing. I should be trying to name these things, identify them, you know, quote unquote, like master my interest in this organism. And this kind of led me to trying to map onto my relationship with lichen and the way I was interacting with it, with this practice of cruising as a kind of alternative mode of intimacy seeking or interaction with the world. So with the example of like not knowing their names, this was like akin to like the anonymity of cruising. So you go to a particular area looking, you know, for a hookup, for sex, and you don't know the name of the person that you might encounter. Or you might not encounter anybody, but you know, there's this like an anonymity. And I was kind of interested in how that also, when you take it back onto like a relationship with nature, often nature writing can have this desire to like give you an encyclopedic knowledge of the thing that it is encountering, you know. So I won't give any examples, because then it would be like X is doing this, but that can be like quite a colonial and patriarchal, you know, it can have all of these connotations of ways of interacting that are about control and about certain types of epistemology. It's slightly destabilizing to think, well, I don't want to not know, like intentionally seek out to just be like, I'm not going to learn the names of any lichens. But it hadn't been like a driving force. That it kind of arose through that. And then there was an opportunity to devise a workshop for a festival called Estuary Festival in Kent, London and Essex. And it happened to be online because it was during the pandemic. I thought I could use that as a way of like thinking through my own practice, both writing and interaction with the natural world. So I did Cruising the Estuary, which was a series of 3 workshops. And then a friend of ours called Tonya, hi Tonya, from Beyond Form Creative Writing, asked if I would do something similar for her platform. So then I moved it away from like a specific site to just cruising nature. That's kind of how cruising nature began and like developed. And then fuck plants. I was gonna say, should I say like beet plants? That was kind of like a follow-on, and I was kind of influenced. I was reading somebody called Stephen Swarbrick. I don't know if you've come across work. So he wrote an essay called Nature's Queer Negativity, and has also written, or his monograph has just come out, which is called The Ecological Unconscious. And he's interested in the relationship between, I mean, this is a very small aspect of what he's interested in. But he's interested in like the way in which like queer theory or queer negativity under the banner of queer theory is related to like ecological thinking. And I became interested in this, and cruising nature had like touched on it, and then fuck plants. The fuck of fuck plants, even though I'm sorry, I'm saying the word too many times there, is kind of like holds the ambivalence of like the loving the object, but also like hating the object. And again, like psychoanalytically speaking, I know psychoanalysis is not everybody's favorite cup of tea. But psychoanalytically speaking, like ambivalence is not indifference. It's like if you love something, if you have the capacity to love something, then you also have the capacity to hate it. Because if you think it can satisfy you, its absence or its resistance can also frustrate you and cause you to be angry. So the fuck of fuck plants kind of what tried to encapsulate this duality or this multiplicity, let's say, of the love and the hate. And it's like not very common in maybe just the circles that I move in, that you're allowed to say, oh, I really hate this plant. like it's just like we should love plants, we should connect with them, we should help them thrive. But like, for example, like I hate hydrangeas. I mean, I maybe hate them less than I used to, but there was a time when I just think they're ugly. I don't like them. I would never want one. Like I just yuck. But there often isn't any forum where it's acceptable to kind of say that you hate that. So I guess I wanted to like create, if you can't do that in like a writing space, like create a playful environment where you might be able to say plants, I really hate this plant or whatever. Then I thought like, if you can't do it on a page, like where can you do it? Yeah, that course also took on this other aspect of something Stephen Swarbrick says, is that nature is like pharmacological. So it's both has the capacity to heal, which is one of the discourses that you get a lot around like queer nature, but it also has the capacity to poison. So like the pharmacon in like Who Derrida is, it's like you can't have one without the other. They're like, they supplement one another and you can't disentangle them. Yeah, the other person, if you're interested, like theoretically, is Elizabeth E. Wilson, who wrote, has written like a really good book called Gut Feminisms, in which she talks about kind of the pharmaceutical industry and that like medicines are not only there to heal, but they also might have a capacity to harm.
Right.
But there's another article, I think it's in, it is in Angalaki, which is a journal of theoretical humanities. It's called Acts Against Nature. And that's a really interesting article. But those two people, as well as, I'll just give my third shout out, as I know this isn't meant to be a theory podcast. It's meant to be about poetry. But these things have like informed what I've been doing. The other person that is interesting to look up and that I've been like reading and thinking about is Jean-Thomas Tremblay, who is a writer and cultural critic and academic. And they say in an article on Tommy Pico, who is a great queer ecological poet, they do talk about the nature of pharmacon, that it's really important to try and hold these two things together rather than like exile like the negative or actually don't like say that nature isn't healing. It's try to think about like there's a tension between the two and they don't necessarily have to be opposed, but like being able to like hold that paradox between those two discourses, or the way in which those two discourses interact, is interesting. I've rambled, but indiscriminate lanking is basically a lot of rambling. So this is like performative of poetry, or the text, I should say.
In the indiscriminate lanking, there's a kind of counter narrative to the urban queer stories we often hear, where, you know, there's a protagonist who moves to the city in order to be freed from heteronormativity. But you've taken queer embodiment back into, you know, the countryside or queer nature. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything like super clever to say about that, other than, you know, that was, I was living in the countryside. I identify as somebody who's queer, and this emerged out of that experience. You know, there is like a discourse of like queer rurality, which I'm interested in. I think like all things, context and aspects of one's identity inform how you experience your embodiment in a rural space, or even particularly in a rural space. So I am like a cis queer man who's, you know, British and white and quite tall, and I feel when I was living and experiencing this rural space that I was living in, more or less, I felt relatively safe. Like I didn't feel threatened, apart from on a few occasions, which was often to do with groups of men or other masculine figures. So I can't really speak to like generic queer rural experience, because I know that those intersections change one's experience. What might be different for queer people, broadly speaking, about being in the countryside or being in a rural space? I was kind of like informed by some of the work of the artist Charlotte Prodger, and they often make their video works. And there was an interview where she said that leaving the town or the city and moving out into a rural space was like one of necessity for her. It was kind of a way of escaping some of like the material pressures that being queer in a more built up area with more people and more like, I guess, discrimination and challenges of being a queer person, that there was something liberating, but out of necessity, to get like a time out and escape from some of those, I guess, oppressions. And I kind of think that there is something, for me anyway, about being in a rural space that both frees you from the eyes of others, and the kind of expectations of others to be a certain way, whether that's in your gender expression or your sexuality, or needing to be a certain way because of other people. And I read a couple of things in lockdown that were kind of reflecting on how not being observed, or having to be observed all of the time, allowed some people to forget about some of those expectations, like gender expectations or expectations of how you should express who you are, because that kind of pressure of being viewed was less present. And I wonder if the countryside can sometimes, and for some people, offer that type of freedom of expectation. I don't know. Does that ring true for you in any way? Or
yeah, I mean, maybe it's different because I grew up in a village. So actually, when people know you, there's a lot of pressure to conform, because when you leave the house, people will always see you going out, and they know who you are. So actually, I felt more watched in a way in a village than I do when I'm in London, for example.
Yeah.
Where there's more anonymity. So you are seen, but people don't know who you are.
However, if I go to the forest or something like that, then that
Yeah.
freedom comes back. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you view eco-poetics from a queer perspective?
Oh yeah, I was going to talk to you about this before we recorded. I don't really think about eco-poetics.
Yeah.
It's not really like a preoccupation of mine. I watched your video with Caleb
Okay.
Kins. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought he gave like a really like academic great answer to this question. I was thinking, I just don't really think like it's not something
Yeah.
that I like spend a lot of time thinking about. Like I guess broadly speaking, I'm kind of interested in like queer ecologies. And if that like tips over or crosses over into poetry, then I'm interested. I guess from a queer perspective, when it comes to eco-poetics, one of the things that I might be drawn to being interested in is like the form. And I guess again, coming back to what I ended up writing in this pamphlet, it was something about queer style or form or syntax that was like interesting to me. If eco-poetics is queer, then it's going to sound and look and feel different than eco-poetics. Again, like coming back to Swarbrick, he talks about often in when we talk about like queer nature and maybe queer poetics, there's this focus on multiplicity and connection and generativity and things like cohering across species and boundaries and porosity, which is all great. But he says that maybe there's a counter narrative or a narrative, but he said it like runs alongside this discourse, and that it's one which is like a disarticulating force of matter where things are ruptured and broken and there's loss, and that maybe these two things need to like run together and be thought of together. And I think maybe that the work which I find interesting in queer ecology or queer ecopoetics also like attends to this this like disarticulating force, which sometimes like embraces that not everything is like has a clear meaning and is like can all be like tied up and made into like this is what queer nature is, or this is what it means to be in this moment in this time. It's like it's much more complex and difficult to be able to articulate that. Yeah, one of the phrases I was just thinking of earlier today, which kind of it's one of the things which sticks and like comes back to me again by it's Freud, sorry. It's that like we're not masters in our own home, that we're like lived by unpredictable forces that we aren't necessarily in control of all the time, and that can be like quite disconcerting. And it doesn't mean that we have to think like that's completely it. We're just like at sea in a sea of chaos. But if we like repress or remove that aspect and only focus on the generative or the connectivity of queerness, then we're going to maybe make queer nature too cozy. It's too easy somehow. It's too like nice and like, oh, nature is queer. Like, imagine that. Like, how fortunate. And I guess that like that impulse to make queer nature like biological, or Jordi Rosenberg, another theorist, talks about like the molecularization of queerness. So like taking it down to that molecular level where atoms are queer. It's just like, well, how fortunate, like that, that the world is just reflecting back like who I am. I've wandered off from ecopoetics a little bit, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I like and enjoy ecopoetics that is queer when it kind of deals with the rupture of matter as well as the connectivity of queer nature.
Could you read a passage from the book?
Yes. So I'm going to read number 9. They don't have titles, so I'm just going to read number 9. Anger at the J is like rattling adults. Believe I can use a different mug this morning if I want to, but take my ritual back to bed. Reaching for the same attempts to contain appetite. Then in the shower, picking up the soap, my ass touches the tiles. Never happened before. Difference too can emerge from reaching. Felt nice. Try it. Jaw ache from masochistic kisses, and my Play-Doh stress ball is a heat-dried rock. Paddy, I'm thinking of you and hope your sculptures are still ongoing. Soon we'll laugh again at our unsociability together. The delphiniums are a bit tickly these last few days, and you wouldn't say a pen step man takes care of itself like you do. I've been talking for a while and said very little, but I appreciate your ears. Tiny sun cream on your lobe. I want to touch, but don't rub it in. Did you hear Herb Robert licking Greater Stitchwort's petals? Call it a dream dump. Call it a lightning of cloud weight. Call it carrying a pouch of marsh frogs as queer kin-making. We secreter little parcels of time together from larger branches of the tulip tree, asking, why would a leaf do that? A laughing woodpecker cannons with the jays, and we are not baby birds, but half children, sat here drawing scribbles in the midday nonsense.
Wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else you would like to add to this interview?
Well, we haven't talked about you being involved in cruising nature and how you associate your practice with what I was calling cruising nature, but you might have called something slightly different.
Yeah, I think for me, your way of cruising nature has been quite interesting in the way it looks at nature, not just as you said, like a benign force or something that only good feelings can flow towards, which I think some eco-criticism sometimes is guilty of. And at the same time, it sort of helped me, I guess, as well as other participants, to connect with aspects of nature that I would not necessarily have paid attention to. And especially when nature is different from what I expected, or things that are a bit maybe uglier, like wastelands, or things like illness in nature. Also taking down that barrier between humanity and nature, kind of exploring those spaces where they blur and they're unclear. So I think, yeah, these are some of the things that you've given me more space to think about that in different ways. And then I think one big advantage of the workshop format is that you really get inspired by what other people are doing, even when they're engaged in a totally different process with a totally different point of view. So yeah, it's been great.
And well, I was also going to say you did an excellent workshop. So we collaborated on one of the workshops for cruising nature, and Danne did tracking the Anthropocene.
Oh yeah,
tracking in the Anthropocene. Trying to think about ways or different forms of movement and tuning into how the Anthropocene is filtered through on those different levels, from a physical to a psychic level. And out of a couple, I think maybe 3 of the workshop series that I've run, so at the end of the workshop, I usually do a collaborative zine whereby work that people have done can be sent in. And I was just gonna, hold please. I was just gonna get, just to show Dan's collages.
Ooh.
This excellent collage. Can you see that?
Yeah. It's not
it's a bit blurry,
but you can see the page.
Yeah. And this other one, which I really loved.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
The owl.
Are you still collaging?
I am still collaging. Actually, I have a piece at the Beanie at the moment.
Oh, what's the exhibition?
It's Claude Carin.
Oh yeah.
I'll post a link as well. Claude Carin.
Yeah, this is Claude Carin.
So they decided to exhibit some LGBTQ artists alongside Claude Carin. So part of the gallery is her work, and then the other side is many different artists, including one of my collages. Thank you for those zines. I couldn't find the first one, but I'm sure I have it somewhere. So
the first two, there's a PDF online, so we can post links.
Mm-hmm.
The Cruising Nature Spring Edition, I think I've only got 2 copies left, and it's not online.
Okay.
And Bug Plants, there's still like 10 copies left if people want one. People can just get in touch on my Instagram if people are interested in one.
Great. So we'll put your Instagram below as well, to your book as well, obviously. Perfect. Thank you so much, Declan.
Thanks, Dan.
I will put all of the links that we discussed and links to some of the zines that we talked about in the box below, so you can click on those and look up the references that I discussed with Declan. I would like to thank him again for this interview. It was a pleasure to talk to him, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon with another video. Bye!